You take it away.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Beth. My name is Daniel Waugh. I'm the author of Off Color, The Violent History of Detroit's Notorious Purple Gang. A little bit about me. I'm not from the Harbor Springs area. I live in the city of Detroit. I'm not a historian or a professional writer even. I drive a bus for a living. I just happen to do this as kind of a hobby and an interest that I've always had pretty much since childhood. Um, the reason I decided to write a book about the Purple Gang is mainly to satisfy my own curiosity. I had been hearing stories about them in my teen years. I read a newspaper retrospective about them in 1994, the Detroit Free Press, that really caught my attention. But this, the pre-internet days, I didn't really have any way of finding out about them. And, being something of a history nerd myself, I decided to look into it more myself as far as doing original research and whatnot. The thing that surprised me about them the most was that no one had ever written an in-depth study of them before. After I got out of the military and I was driving a cab in Detroit for Checker Company, I spent a lot of time picking up fares in the old neighborhood in the north end and the near west side of Detroit where the Purple Gang lived. And I recognized a lot of the addresses from my research, and I started to cobble facts together and take an attempt at writing a book. It wasn't published until 2014, but yes, the book you see on the screen before you is the labor of my love, if you will. Go ahead and take a look at the next slide. The Purple Gang was from Detroit, of course, in the early 20th century. Ethnically, the vast majority of them were Jewish Americans. Quite a few of them were born in a section of the Russian Empire, which no longer exists anymore, which was called the Pale of Settlement. That is where Imperial Russia, that was headed by the Tsar, decreed that all Jewish citizens were to live. They didn't have a lot of the same rights or economic opportunities that Gentiles in Russia did. And a lot of them migrated to different points of the globe to have a better life. And many of the Jewish immigrants who came to the city of Detroit settled in an area north of Gratiot Avenue and east of Woodward Avenue. That was known colloquially as Little Jerusalem. Little Jerusalem wasn't a completely homogenous Jewish neighborhood. There were plenty of other ethnicities living there as well. But in fact, one Jewish resident of the neighborhood said later in his retirement years, you could always tell the Jewish and non-Jewish families apart. The Gentiles grew flowers in front of their house. The Jews grew dirt. So even whatever poverty they had in Detroit, though, was infinitely better than what they had to deal with in Eastern Europe. But some of the kids that grew up there started getting into trouble. And that's kind of where the Purple Gang comes into play. I'd like to say that the Purple Gang is the name that just about everybody in the state of Michigan has heard at least once in some kind of context or another. To this day, we're not exactly sure where it came from. The best known story, and this is where the title of my book comes from, it was printed in the Detroit News, and it told the story of a couple of vegetable peddlers on Hastings Street, which is like the main drag of Little Jerusalem. And their push carts had been robbed by a couple of delinquents from the neighborhood. And one of the owners complained to the others, those boys are rotten, they're tainted, they're like bad meat, almost like they're purple. And his buddy, who was agreeing with him, said, yeah, purple, that's right, they're a purple gang. That's the most popular version, but it's almost certainly fictional. Another idea as to where the name came from comes from the so-called cleaners and dyers war, which I'll talk about in a little bit, where they were terrorizing cleaning plants and cleaning shops. And in order to ruin the clothes that were being cleaned at the cleaning plants, they would douse those clothes with cans of purple paint. Another story pertains to a member of the gang called Eddie Fletcher, who was a professional boxer. And when he and his seconds came out to the ring during a fight, they all had on purple jerseys. Another version is pretty benign when one of the former members says that they were just sitting around their clubhouse one day and decided to discuss changing their name. Somebody in the room, a kid named Scotty Silverstein, was wearing a purple sweater. Somebody suggested Purple Gang, and bam, there you go. But probably the most logical explanation as to where the name Purple Gang came from is from a very media-savvy Detroit police inspector by the name of Henry Garvin, who reportedly described them as such, the Purple Gang, to a reporter in early 1928. Now we'll go ahead and check out the next slide here. There's a mugshot of them in their prime. This would have been taken About in May of 1929, I think is when it was snapped. But the vast majority of the Purple Gang gangsters were too young for military service in World War I. Most of them went to the same school in Little Jerusalem on Winder Street called the Bishop Union School. The Bishop Union School was really two schools in one. You had the normal school with like the regular curriculum, and next door to the school was an ungraded trade school for problem kids who were always getting into trouble. And yeah, once you know it, most of the Purple Gang, they wound up in the ungraded trade school. And when they bothered to attend school, they used to spend most of their spare time in the yard shooting craps. But while they were shooting dice, they happened to gain the attention of older, established Jewish gangsters in the neighborhood, most of whom had come out to Detroit from New York City a couple of years earlier. And right around the time that they were going through school is when alcohol was outlawed in the state of Michigan. Excuse me. Booze became illegal in Michigan on May 1st, 1918, a full 2 years before the rest of the country. There were a series of acts that made consumption and transportation and manufacture of alcohol completely illegal. Most of the breweries and distilleries in the state went out of business, except for a handful who had the financial resources to ride out Prohibition. The Stroh Brewery was one. They switched to making ice cream and malt syrup, that kind of thing. The malt syrup was kind of a wink thing for normal citizens if they wanted to cook their own booze. I mean, one guy remembered buying it back during Prohibition. He says, "We all knew that it wasn't meant for baking cakes." But in the early years of Prohibition, the kids from Hastings Street who were getting into trouble started getting into more serious crimes like armed robbery, assault, jewelry theft, even homicide in a couple of cases. Looking back, it's kind of easy to wonder how this could have happened because the vast majority of them came from law-abiding families. Some were even like relatively middle class. They just took a hard left turn into trouble for whatever reason. Once they quit going to school altogether, they got a job at a place on Oakland Avenue in Little Jerusalem that was nicknamed the Sugar House. It was a warehouse that sold sacks of corn sugar and malt and hops and other ingredients that would allow people to manufacture both liquor and beer during Prohibition. The Sugar House was run by a couple of guys out of New York named Isidore Cantor and George Goldberg. Goldberg was originally from Canada. Izzy Cantor, he said that, all I do is just sell sugar. What people do after it is, their choice. And many of the young kids from the Purple Gang ended up getting jobs with him, either selling sugar or whatnot. Basically the birth of the Purple Gang centers around a couple of groups of brothers. Go ahead and take a look at the next slide. The first main group of brothers are the Bernstein brothers. In the lower left-hand corner is Abe Bernstein, the eldest. He was actually significantly older than his brothers and just about everybody else in the future Purple Gang. When Michigan Prohibition began in 1918, I think he was about 27 years old, which was, pretty old. Well, most of the rest of them were still in grade school or high school or whatever. He was very brilliant, but he was also somewhat quiet and reserved. And he was very innovative. He worked for Ford Motor Company. He started working for Ford Motor Company in about 1913, but he ended up quitting them eventually a few years later and going to work for a gambler whose nickname was Joe Murphy, who had an illegal gambling parlor on Hastings Street. It was in the back of a dry goods store, and it was known as the quote-unquote working man's cafe. To the right there is the second brother, Joe Bernstein. Joe Bernstein was the temperamental one of the bunch. He was the one who was always out in the street fighting. He was a little guy. They used to call him Little Joey. He wasn't more than about 5'3" or 5'4" inches tall, but he was, was as tough as nails. And up in the upper left-hand corner there is Raymond Bernstein, third brother. Raymond was kind of he was closer to a lot of the younger members of the gang because age-wise, he was younger than both Abe and Joey Bernstein were. He was, if there was one of the Bernstein brothers that was actually a cold-blooded trigger puller, would have been Raymond there. He most definitely liked to get his hands there. There's also a fourth younger brother, Izzy, who is not pictured here. We can go ahead and take a look at the next slide here. Here are some of the other members connected to them. The upper left-hand corner there with that fantastic hairdo is Harry Fleischer, the oldest of three brothers who were lifelong friends with the Bernsteins. They grew up with them in Jerusalem. They went to the Bishop Union School. Their family name was originally Fleisch, just one syllable like that. But when Harry there got arrested for the first time in 1921, a desk sergeant inadvertently tacked an ER onto his last name, Fleischer. And that's how they all became notorious as. Harry was as much of a tough guy that Raymond Bernstein might have been. Harry Fleischer was on a whole other level. He became known as, quite frankly, one of the gang's most dangerous assassins. Whenever somebody exceptionally dangerous needed to be killed, they always gave the job to Harry Fleischer right there. In the lower left-hand corner is Harry Fleischer's younger brother, Louis. Louis was a genius with automobiles. He learned how to repair them inside and out. Their father, Louis Fleischer Sr., who owned a pretty profitable junkyard on Hastings Street that was actually a hangout for the delinquent kids when they were, skipping out of school or whatnot. Louis Fleischer actually spent a good deal of the coming years of Prohibition in prison for a tire truck hijacking, but he eventually made a name for himself in a lot of different ways. Both Lou Fleischer, Harry, and another brother named Sam Fleischer, all three of them would eventually serve time in Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary, California. Up in the upper right-hand corner there, we see Henry Shore. Henry Shore took over control of the Oakland Sugar House gang after Izzy Cantor had been murdered in a gang war, which I'm about to discuss. Henry Shore got a start working for a produce packer in Eastern Market. He had a big muscular build. He spent his whole day throwing sacks of potatoes around into trucks. And below him there in the lower right-hand corner is Charlie Leiter, his partner. Leiter was one of the guys that came out here from New York a few years earlier. In fact, he even got his start as a vegetable peddler on Hastings Street. There's even a little bit of something of a gangland myth that Charlie Leiter may have been the vegetable peddler that the kids, robbed and screwed with that one day that spawned the whole off-color myth story. Matt, go ahead and take a look at the next slide, please. Okay. There's another couple individuals, two younger members of the Purple Gang, veterans of the Bishop Union School. On the left there, that handsome-looking gentleman is Sam Davis, who was alternately known as Stinky for his fantastic personal hygiene habits, and the Gorilla because of his simian facial features. Wasn't very tall at all, and I think his tallest height measurement was like 5'1". But he was built like a truck. He had a very muscular build, almost like King Kong or something. And he was very agile. In fact, whenever he had a job to kill somebody or whatnot, he wouldn't go up the stairs. He would climb up the outside of the house, up the mortar, and climb in a window. On the right there is Harry Keywell. Harry Keywell and his older brother Phil were two other original members of the Purple Gang. Their father also owned a junkyard on Hastings Street, right next door to the Fleisch brothers. They got to know each other and they got dragged into crime as well. By early 1923, most of the guys that I just mentioned were either working in or around the Sugar House on Oakland Avenue, but they eventually attracted the attention of the local mafia, specifically a faction of the local mafia led by an Italian gangster by the name of Chester Lamare. Chester Lamare wasn't Sicilian like just about all the rest of Detroit's mafia at the time, but he was a member of them, and he ran a crew out of a restaurant called the Venice Cafe on Joseph Campo Avenue in Hamtramck. Excuse me. Years earlier, he had extorted a bunch of Jewish gamblers who operated in and around Hastings Street, one of whom was Joe Murphy. Abe Bernstein's original mentor. And so because he had extorted these Jewish gamblers in the past, he thought it'd be no problem to go into the Oakland Sugar House and extort them again because he thought they were docile, they were tough, etc. Can we go ahead and take a look at the next slide, please? Okay, there's a shot of bootleggers smuggling some booze ashore at the foot of Riopelle Street here in Detroit. It's taken by an investigative journalist for the Detroit News in 1929. According to what the journalist said, like this entire operation from start to finish took just 5 minutes. But anyway, back to Chester Lamar and the Oakland Sugar House. He sent a couple of extortionists around Izzy Cantor, to get some protection money out of him. As he refused them, and then a couple of days later on Hastings Street, Izzy Cantor ran into one of the extortionists and they went for their guns, and Cantor ended up shooting him dead. It was ruled justifiable homicide. Him and George Goldberg were given permission to carry firearms the whole 9 yards. But killing that extortionist gained the enmity of not only Chester Lamar, but the entire Detroit Mafia. And a shooting war ensued. At one point, the Venice Cafe crew sent a car past the Oakland Sugar House and shot the place to shreds with shotguns and possibly a Browning automatic rifle. If I remember correctly, 2 people were killed, and a whole bunch of others, including Isidore Cantor himself, were wounded. The Mafia eventually caught up with Izzy Cantor in New York. In February of 24, he went back there to arrange for a damaged car to be shipped back there or something or other. And they caught up with him there and murdered him. And a few months later, his body was fished out of the East River. But with the death of Izzy Cantor, though, is Henry Shore and Charlie Leiter, who were pictured earlier. They not only took over the Oakland Sugar House, they also entered into a good working arrangement with the Mafia. They said, hey, there's plenty of money to be had for everybody. There's no reason why we can't work together. And so you would think that like that gang war would have been the death blow for the Oakland Sugar House gang, but it wasn't. And that's another thing I'd like to discuss. If you look in depth at the Purple Gang, you'll see a lot of different names floating around attached to them. The Oakland Sugar House gang, the 3rd Street Navy, et cetera, the Little Jewish Navy, et cetera, et cetera. All of these gangs were basically the same people, the Purple Gang. They just, operate different crews, if you will. I kind of like to describe the Purple Gang as being structured in tiers. They didn't have a traditional pyramidal command structure like the Mafia did. The top tier gangsters, of course, would be the original brothers that I was talking about earlier. The Bernstein brothers, the Fleischers, the Keywells, a few other people. Henry Leiter, Henry Shore, and Charles Leiter would be there. The second tier were the guys that were the most powerful strong arm artists, the killers. Guys like Abe Axler and Eddie Fletcher. They might be on the next slide here. Let's go ahead and take a look. No, they're not. That's just it. That is a popular photo that you see in a lot of books about Prohibition. This was taken on Lake St. Clair, which I live very close to. During the winter, when it was frozen solid, bootleggers would often drive booze right across it on the ice, but every now and again, the ice gave way, as you can see there. Here's a picture of 2 members of the local mafia. On the second from the left there is Black Bill Tocco, and second from the right there is Joe Zarelli. They were 2 Sicilian mobsters, and they basically took over the family in 1931. Jumping a little ahead of myself here, but they had a good working relationship with the Purples, and there we go. On the upper left-hand corner is Abe Axler, and below him is Eddie Fletcher. They were lifelong best friends. They came out from New York in the mid-1920s. Eddie Fletcher, on the lower left-hand corner there, was actually a professional boxer. He was a featherweight. He fought in Madison Square Garden and a whole bunch of other places in the New York area. At one point in 1924, he even ran for alderman in New York City. He lost, and for reasons that we don't know, took a hard left turn into crime. He grew up in the little Lower East Side next door to Abe Axler, the upper left-hand corner, and Abe's cousin Simon, both of whom served time in New York's hardest prisons for burglary. They were locked up in Dannemora, Sing Sing, Auburn, you name it. They were ice cold killers, and they were very inseparable. In fact, people often called Abe Axler and Eddie Fletcher the Siamese twins because they were literally joined at the hip together. They were originally from the same part of Eastern Europe. They grew up together in New York. They eventually went to prison together. They killed together. They lived in the same apartment building. And when the time came in 1933, they were slaughtered together. To the right there is Irving Milberg. He was another guy that came out from New York during the Oakland Sugar House fight in 1923. He was from Williamsburg, Brooklyn, and known as the most accurate pistol shot in the gang. That they say he could, whenever they had target practice sessions or whatever, he always came out the winner. This is another associate of theirs by the name of Fred Burke. Fred Burke wasn't from Detroit at all. He was originally from Kansas. He got in trouble over a land fraud scheme when he was about 17 years old. See, that's what's crazy about this guy. He actually started out studying veterinary medicine, but because he got in trouble because of that land fraud scheme, he fled his family in disgrace across the state line into Missouri, and he became attached to a St. Louis gang by the name of Egan's Rats, who incidentally was the subject of my very first book. After he fought in World War I as a tank sergeant in the tank corps, and he served prison time in both. He got in trouble in Detroit in 1919 for forgery and ended up serving a year in Jackson prison. Then he was extradited to Missouri and served another year and a half in Jefferson City. By the mid-1920s, he was back in Detroit with some associates of his, working for a Purple Gang liquor distributor by the name of Johnny Reed. Most of the alcohol that the Purple Gang dealt with, especially in the early years of the 1920s, wasn't smuggled across by them. They were into hijacking. The Purple Gang's big thing, at least initially, was hijacking. They let other people do the hard work of smuggling the booze across the Detroit River, and then they just either pistol whip them or shoot them and then steal the liquor and sell it on their own. Eventually, they got enough money from this and from various illegal gambling enterprises where they were able to make deals with Canadian smugglers for genuine whiskey. One of the items of Canadian whiskey that they dealt with was an American bourbon that was distilled in Montreal called Old Log Cabin. And their number one customer for that was that gentleman on the right there, Chicago gang boss Al Capone. It's kind of an urban myth that the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, the results of which you see on the left there, were caused because Chicago's North Side gang, Al Capone's rivals, hijacked a shipment of Purple Gang booze. To be honest, I've researched the St. Valentine's Day Massacre for 30 years, and I can say that is not the case. The Purple Gang had nothing to do with it. The meeting that day at the Chicago garage was called for completely different reasons. It didn't involve the Purple Gang or their booze or anything like that. But people in Detroit thought the Purple Gang was behind it, and they themselves did nothing to dissuade that notion. In fact, the Purple Gang were the very first ones to use the Thompson submachine gun in a gangland hit in Detroit. A couple of their associates had been killed, and they lured the men responsible to an apartment house on Alexandrine Avenue, just east of Woodward Avenue. In fact, this apartment building was probably just a baseball's throw away from where the Garden Bowl is, if anyone's familiar with Detroit geography. Anyway, once the targets showed up at the spot, the Purple Gang mowed them all down with fire. And they hired the gentleman that I showed earlier, Fred Killer Burke, as the machine gunner in that hit. And it was Fred Killer Burke, coincidentally, who was the primary shooter in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. But by 1928, he and the Purple Gang had a serious falling out. But this is probably my favorite overall picture of the Purple Gang. This was taken at the aftermath in the wake of what's called the Cleaners and Dyers War. Through a brother-in-law of the Bernstein brothers, the Purple Gang infiltrated Detroit's cleaning and dyeing industry. What they did was put the squeeze on the owners of cleaning plants to cough up a percentage of their profits every month or whatever it was. And those that disagreed, their plants got destroyed by bombs. Many of them were beaten. A few of them were even killed. Finally, in the wake of one particularly nasty murder, the cleaners broke 3 years of silence, and they went to the police and spilled their guts and told them what was going on. And the cops rounded up a lot of the key members. Seated in front of the group there is Abe Axler. From left to right, we have Abe Axler's cousin Simon. There's Eddie Fletcher, Sam Goldfarb, Philip Keywell, Abe Zussman, Willie Lax, Harry Fleischer, who obviously blinked when the camera clicked, and on the far right there is another guy by the name of Jack Stein. Most of the guys you see in this picture and a couple others who aren't pictured were eventually charged with extortion. There was a big trial over the course of the summer of 1928, and it ended with all of the Purple Gang members getting acquitted across the board. And it ended up seeming like they were untouchable. But that was probably the high watermark in their history. After that, because the Purple Gang was always loosely structured to begin with, a couple guys started going off on their own, figuring I can make more money without having to kick money up, part of my profits up to the Bernstein brothers or whatever. A group of the guys, Purples, who went off on their own were three gentlemen who were originally from Chicago, named Joe Leibovitz, Izzy Sucker, and Jaime Paul. They were originally part of the Third Street Navy, and they kind of went off on their own. But those guys were as tough as they come. In fact, they had originally gotten into trouble in Chicago by shaking down some of Al Capone's speakeasies. That just goes to show you that they had no qualms whatsoever about poking the hornet's nest, if you will. They went into business for themselves. They were known as the Third Street Terrors. They were known as being exceptionally violent, often killing when they were just supposed to maim. In one instance, they stole a load of liquor from an Irish crew in Corktown. And a night or so later, the Irish guys went back to try to steal their booze back, and they managed to get the trunk out of the garage. But the Third Avenue Terrors, they chased after them in a big delivery truck, while one of their number, Joe Leibovitz, leaned out the side window and fired a machine gun at their car, shot it to pieces, killed one of them, the whole 9 yards. It's literally the kind of scene that you almost never see outside of an action movie, but it happened in real life. By the summer of 1931, however, the Third Street Terrors had fallen on hard times. They were losing a lot of business. They were reduced to running a handbook, which is where horse bets were made and whatnot. They got in trouble with the Sicilian mob because, well, basically the Sicilian mob decided to screw them over. They hit them with a couple of fixed horse races, but they didn't have the money to pay off these bettors. So what they had to do was buy pure alcohol from the Purple Gang and sell it on credit in order to pay off the guys from the mafia. So it's kind of, I don't know, I guess you could say it's kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul, if you will. But eventually they got so overextended that the Purple Gang decided to get rid of them. They lured him to a meeting at the Collingwood Manor Apartments at 1740 Collingwood Avenue. Once they were there, all seated on the couch, smoking cigars, they were all mowed down with pistol fire. The three individuals involved in that were Harry Fleischer, Harry Keywell, and Irving Milburn. Ray Bernstein was on the scene too. The only trouble was the Purples let a friend of theirs live, Solly Levine. He came to the apartment with the Third Street Terrors and miraculously wasn't hit by the barrage of gunfire. But his survival was part of a scheme that Ray Bernstein had kicked up. What he wanted to do was get Solly out of there and abduct him later that night and plant one of the murder weapons on his body to frame him for the murders. Unfortunately for Ray Bernstein and the Purple Gang, the cops got to Solly Levine first. He spilled his guts, and he was the star witness in the upcoming murder trial. And Ray Bernstein, Harry Keywell, and Irving Milburn were all convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. After that, the fortunes of the gang really turned south. By that point in time, the Sicilian Mafia had finished a pretty violent gang war of their own, a civil war. They had reorganized to the point where they were controlling just about all of the city's rackets, and there just really wasn't room for the Purple Gang anymore. One of the mobsters of the New Order was Joe Bomarito there on the left. He engaged in a notorious feud with a younger member of the Purple Gang, who you see there on the right, Harry Millman. Harry Millman probably could have like stepped from central casting as a Hollywood mobster. He was handsome, he was charismatic, he was a big time fist fighter. He always he was a big hit with the ladies, and he had a devil may care attitude. He was also one of the hitmen who killed Abe Axler and Eddie Fletcher in 1933. Those two had been killed because they embezzled money from Abe Bernstein that was supposed to be used for the purchase of a brewery after the repeal of Prohibition in 1933. There's a story in Detroit gangland lore, which I tend to believe, it's in my book, that Harry Bowman and Joe Bomarito got into a bar fight with each other. Now, by anyone's, by this point in time, Joe Bomarito is Capitacina, a captain in the mafia. And by anyone's standards, he's a ruthless killer. I mean, a normal person wouldn't even dare to lay so much as a finger on Joe Bomarito. But Harry Bowman got into it with him, and they apparently slugged it out for the better part of a half hour, laying waste to the bar in the process. And basically, Bomarito was beaten into a hospital bed, which essentially signed Harry's death warrant. But Harry Bowman did not care. He continued to antagonize the mob. At one point later that year, Joe Bomarito was in a barber's chair, getting a shave. He had a hot towel over his face, and Harry Bowman darted into the barber shop, lifted up the towel, and spit right in his face, and then ran. It's like something you'd see in a comedy or something. But it wasn't funny at all, though, because eventually they caught up with him on Thanksgiving night in 1937. He was in a delicatessen at 12th and Hazelwood Street on the near west side of Detroit. It's called Boski's. Anyway, he was in there and partying with some of his friends, and a couple guys stalked up to him at the bar and just pumped him full of 12 bullets. Killed another one of his guys that was with him and wounded about 4 or 5 other innocent bystanders. According to gangland lore, the two killers who did that were brought in from New York, Murder Incorporated. Take it to the next slide. I think I got a couple of pictures of them here. That is a picture of Harry Bowman's car before he was shot to death at the bar on Thanksgiving of '37. A couple months beforehand, the local mob tried to knock him off with a car bomb. Unfortunately, Harry was coming out of a nightclub. He tossed his keys to the valet, sent the valet to get his car. The car blew. And unfortunately, the valet, who's a 39-year-old man by the name of Willie Holmes, was unfortunately killed in the explosion. There's the aftermath right there. But yeah, there's the delicatessen where Harry Bowman was shot dead, 12th and Hazelwood, right after it happened. That building, and along with most of the other buildings along there, is no longer standing. Look at the next slide. Okay. By the late 30s, prison sentences and inter-gang murders had really chipped away at the Purple Gang's power. They really weren't even that much of a big deal anymore. They still had their political contacts, though. Perhaps their premier political contact was this gentleman right here, Frank McKay. Frank McKay was a Republican power broker from Grand Rapids, who for many years controlled the Republican state party, and he was able to influence a lot of lawmakers to do his bidding. Frank McKay, the best I can figure out, first became associated with the Purple Gang in the spring of 1930, when he was still the state treasurer. He entered into a scheme with Purple Gang member Henry Shore in order to provide Shore with the ability to get tax-free malt stamps for, like, the malt that he would sell and whatnot for making whiskey. And in return for this and other back scratches, the Purple Gang would serve as McKay's enforcers. Whenever a lawmaker in Lansing or elsewhere in the state of Michigan needed a little bit extra convincing, Frank McKay could call in the Purple Gang for it. In fact, that's how Henry Shore ended up getting killed. In 1934, he got into it with Frank McKay in a dispute over another man by the name of John Gillespie, who I can't remember what his exact political position was, but Shore went to bat for Gillespie, and McKay basically blew them both off. So Henry Shore drove up to Grand Rapids to Frank McKay's mansion, basically stomped inside, basically reverted to full gangster, grabbed him by the collar, basically made him beg for his life, and told him he's going to do whatever the heck he told him to, whenever. But of course, as soon as Henry left and started driving back to Detroit, McKay got on the phone to the other members of the Purple Gang. This guy's scaring me. You have to do something about it. So 48 hours later, Henry Shore was lured to a meeting with Charlie Leiter at a deli on 12th Street and was never heard from again that night. All they ever found of him was a blood-splattered car that Harry Fleischer was driving around in Detroit in broad daylight, with bloodstains all over the inside of it. But Henry Shore's body, though, was never found, so nobody ever got prosecuted for it. In fact, Henry Shore's disappearance bears quite a lot of similarities to that of Teamsters leader Jimmy Hoffa 40-something years later. By the early 1940s, Frank McKay was kind of in trouble because there was an investigation going on into the fact that McKay and his Purple Gang allies had arranged for a number of senators to kill a bill in the Michigan State Legislature that would have installed totalizers at racetracks. And one of the senators who got pressured to kill this bill was this gentleman right here, State Senator Warren Hooper. Hooper wasn't really cut out for dealing with Michigan state politics back then. It was a completely different animal than it is now. And he eventually found himself getting taken advantage of by the more powerful McKay and brushing elbows with rough guys like the Purple Gang. That just wasn't his bag. So he decided to roll over and turn state's evidence. And the Purple Gang plotted to get rid of him. I should say the radically depleted Purple Gang. At this point, there's probably no more than a dozen of them left. There were a couple of plots to go out to Albion to kill Hooper, either at his house or at his office, and they missed. But finally, the senator was shot to death as he drove on a highway north of Springport, Michigan, in January of 1945. While a few Purple Gang members would eventually be convicted of conspiracy to kill him, namely Harry Fleischer, his younger brother Sam Fleischer, Mikey Selleck, and another guy by the name of Pete Mahoney. They all got prison sentences. But the murder itself is still unofficially unsolved, even though we pretty much know what happened. It came out later through a later investigation and informant testimony that the imprisoned Purples who went to prison for the Collingwood Massacre, Raymond Bernstein and Harry Kewell, had been transferred to Jackson Prison by the early 1940s. And they pretty much ran the prison from top to bottom. They controlled both the warden, the assistant warden. They had the best jobs. They had comfortable cells, and they could leave go on picnics. That was probably their biggest perk of all, is that Bernstein and Kewell and the others in the Purple Gang clique could essentially leave the prison whenever they felt like it. And that's what it's believed that they did in order to get rid of Hooper. After Harry Fleischer and the outside Purples couldn't get the job done, Ray Bernstein and Harry Kewell, along with clothing, a weapon, and a vehicle that had been supplied by the warden, the assistant warden, drove out of the prison, Jackson Prison that day, with the use of a couple of accomplices, tracked Hooper on the highway and staged a car accident and killed him, then went right back to the prison. They had the best alibi in the world. Why they were never prosecuted, it's hard to tell, but we're pretty sure that's what happened to them. Well, of course, when the scandal broke, Ray Bernstein and Harry Kewell were transferred back north to the maximum security facility at Marquette in the Upper Peninsula. And yet, in February of 1954, they arranged for a hockey game between the inmates of Marquette Prison and the Detroit Red Wings. Ever since their inception, Ray Bernstein had been a huge fan of the Detroit Red Wings and ice hockey in general. And he continued that fandom even through all his years in prison. He had always been a close friend of Jack Adams, right there on the right. And it was Bernstein and Kewell who convinced Jack Adams to stage this game between the convicts and the 1950s era Red Wings. And it was a big success. I'm paraphrasing here, but I think Gordie Howe said he was talking to one guy, asking him, "You seem like a nice guy. What are you doing in here?" He's like, "Oh, my friend, he was fell on a knife I was holding. He fell on it 5 times. The darndest thing. It was a total accident." Eventually, Hollywood did get a hold of the Purple Gang. They came out with a B movie about them in 1960, starring Robert Blake as Honey Boy Willard. That was one of the nicknames of one of the more prominent members of the gang, Joe Honey Boy Miller, who of all things actually wasn't Jewish. He was Sicilian, go figure. It's been a lot of years since I've seen this, but it's a good nostalgia piece. But yeah, they could definitely use an update for it. The vast majority of the Purple Gang members who were in prison eventually did get out. Raymond Bernstein suffered a severe stroke in the spring of 1963, and he was granted a mercy parole not long after that. He was immediately admitted to the U of M Medical Center in Ann Arbor and died there in 1966. Phil Keywell was paroled in 1965, still a relatively young man at 54. And he went completely legit. He married, found employment, and never tangled with the law again. In fact, out of all the key members of the Purple Gang, Harry Keywell survived the longest. He passed away in August of 1997 of Alzheimer's disease down in Florida. So unfortunately now, yeah, at this point in time, just about all members of the Purple Gang are no longer living. And there's even they're still remain in pop culture. I mean, you hear their name all the time. Here in Detroit, there's a microbrewery, the Atwater Brewery, that markets a beer called the Purple Gang Pilsner. It's not bad if you ever had a chance to try it. Okay, well, that pretty much concludes what I had to say for the moment. If you guys have any questions for me, I'd be happy to answer them if I can.
Well, thank you so much, Daniel.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, that was lovely. I mean, it was gritty and a very interesting history. I think we'll probably have to learn more from your book. And I believe we will have some copies of your book at the Historical Society at the museum. So if anybody's interested, please do let us know. Otherwise, where can they find your book, Daniel?
They can find it on Amazon.com. It's available there along with everything else I've written. Please, by all means, feel free to pick it up, and I hope you enjoy it. If you do enjoy it, please feel free to leave a 5-star rating on Amazon.com. And thanks for reading, and thanks for joining me here this evening.
Yeah, I'm looking in the chat, and I think we'll wait just a minute to see if we do have any questions pop up before we end. Oh, and it looks like Lee's mentioning that Daniel, his great uncle, was Joe Leibovitz, who was one of the victims of the Collingwood Manor massacre.
Yes, I've communicated with Lee before. Yep.
Sure. Oh, that's kind of fantastic that you're here, Lee. I'm glad that you were able to make it for the presentation. That's some crazy history that you have right there, some family history. Let's see. Does anyone else have any quick questions that they want? I'm waiting in case anybody's typing furiously. Let's see. Why did Capone let them leave Chicago? Is a question.
I think Al was being magnanimous. When they were shaking down his speakeasies, he sent some muscle to talk to your great grandfather and the other two, and basically told them, like, no, either the shakedowns or your lives are going to end. Either way. And your great grandfather and the others decided, took the we'll just get out of town and let it go.
Gotcha. Let's see. There are a couple more questions. Let's see. Have you heard of Dr. Carter? I heard he was one of the doctors for the Purple Gang.
Actually, no. I'm sorry. I don't believe I have heard of Dr. Carter.
Well, I'll have to. So that question was from Sharon, and Sharon, if you have any more information about that, you can feel free to email it to me, and I'll make sure it gets passed along. Let's see. Sarah asks if the Purple Gang ever came to the Harbor Springs area.
To be honest, I don't know any specifics about what they might have done in the Harbor Springs area, and I took another look into it before this presentation. I couldn't find anything, but I don't doubt that they did. I mean, hey, not all of them could go off to Miami and to Cuba. They definitely went to many different places in Michigan. So I don't have any doubt that some of them might have been up in the Harbor Springs area. Sure.
Well, and if you'd like to learn more about that, perfect segue. Next Thursday here at the museum, I'll be talking about Harbor Springs' connections to Prohibition, and its connection to the Purple Gang is less strong than some other areas. Basically, they were more financial backers. They didn't have an active sort of presence here in the area, except for maybe one member named Sam Bernstein. Fatty is what he was called. Who was up here with a gentleman named Al Gerhardt running a place called Club Manitou. So I'll be getting into some of that during my lecture. But in terms of their presence, I'm with you, Daniel. I don't know if I've ever I haven't come across anything yet, but I'll have to keep looking and see if any of them made their way up here.
Sam Bernstein does ring a bell. There was a Sam Bernstein associated with the Purple Gang.
Mhm.
He was a brother-in-law of. He's not related to the other Bernstein brothers, the leaders. This Sam Bernstein was a brother-in-law of Louis Fleischer,
Mhm.
who they operated in central Michigan for a period of time in the mid 30s, like Albion, that area. Sam Bernstein was they used to call him Tiny Sam because he was huge. He weighed 355 plus pounds or whatever. But yeah, I've definitely heard of him. Absolutely.
Yeah, I've heard him called Fatty. That's my
Yeah, that's no.
that's the nickname I've heard for him. Let's see. Oh yeah, some more fun history from Lee here.
Oh wow, I never knew that, Lee. Wow.
Yeah, that's very cool. Let's see. Well, I'm not seeing any more questions in the chat, and I think people have had enough time to type. So I'm going to assume that everyone's curiosity is sated, or you're waiting to buy the book. Without any further ado, I want to say thank you so much, Daniel. That was a wonderful presentation. We're very excited to have you. And
Yeah, thanks for having me, Beth.
yeah, thanks for joining us, and good night to everybody here. And hopefully we'll see you at one of our other lectures soon.
All right. Good night, Lee.
Bye.